Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. I want to say welcome to Anthony McPhail and everyone else that's out there listening. Thank you so much for your patience. Unburdened by Conscience has a preface that I want you to listen to because we have to think about the context within which he was writing. Barack Obama had been elected president, and I really believe he thought he was writing for a post racial world. Almost 30 years ago, while pursuing my Bachelor of Arts degree in college, I took a lot of Black Studies courses, having developed a thirst for the study of my history. During that time, I also elected courses on the history of American slavery. Like most of the classes that I took in college, I recall sitting in those American slavery classes surrounded by white students. The classes were taught by white professors as well, who assigned history books written mostly by Caucasian historians. They included Ulrich B. Phillips, Kenneth M. Stamps, Stanley M. Elkins, Gerald Mullen, Eugene D. Genovese, Robert W. Fogel, and Stanley L. Ingerman. A lot of those people were eugenicists, which means they believed in scientific racism. Some, with the exception of a few, those historians offered essentially an unapologetic Southern view of American slavery. It was a benign institution. They focused primarily on the slaveholders, whom they euphemistically called Southern planters. Although each historian chose different words to convey his message about the slaveholders, the message was almost always the same, which was brutal and inhumane masters were the exception to the general rule. The majority of Southern planters were good people who were morally concerned about the welfare of their slaves. Enslaved Blacks suffered less than any other class in the antebellum South because they were well cared for and adequately fed by their owners. Masters pursued a policy of kindness whenever possible, offering their slaves rewards and positive incentives for good behavior. The few historians who acknowledged the cruel suffering that Black people had endured under the American slavery regime insisted that whatever wrongdoing the slaveholders had committed was understandable within the context of their society. Others told us that some masters who were forced to physically correct their disobedient slaves were defensive and apologetic about it. As I read those history textbooks about American slavery, it dawned on me that I was not the intended audience. From the information those historians have presented, I quickly gathered that they were offering feel better about the past history written primarily for my white classmates. Some of the required reading that my professors had assigned offered us irrational arguments and explanations for the prolonged enslavement of Black people. American slavery was the best school yet invented for the mass training of Blacks who were slow and backward. Since Africans in America had no appreciation for freedom and independence, they could gain it only through acculturation by adopting the culture and values of Europeans. After completing my assigned reading, I harbored a deep resentment because I believed that I had been required to read propaganda for academic credit. It was also apparent to me that in trying to humanize the slaveholders, most of those historians were leaving out the indispensable part of their record: the slave owners' countless acts of murder, their disturbing use of torture, and the fear of with which they filled their slaves. Why was the American slavery regime able to survive for so long? Was it really because the enslaved blacks were well cared for and fed adequately by their owners and believed them to be good people? Was it because Africans in America had no appreciation for freedom and independence? I felt compelled to offer another viewpoint on American slavery, a Black people's perspective. After all, what people are better qualified to provide a true and accurate account of slavery in the United States than those former slaves who endured it? I conducted my own research, reading innumerable slave narratives and contemporaneous accounts of American slavery. My ancestors left behind considerable record. Some revealed horrendous acts committed by slaveholders, things rarely discussed in the American slavery history books that we have been required to read in college. Indeed, courageous former slaves such as Henry Johnson, Ben Simpson, Rose Williams, and others exposed the full horrors of American slavery at a time when it might have placed them in danger for having done so. Determined to present slavery from their point of view, to provide a Black people's collective account of America's antebellum South, I offered this book as the product of that effort. The work is divided into 4 sections. In part 1, I examine the historiography on the brutality of American slavery. I then permit the ex-slaves to speak for themselves, revealing the forms of torture used by the slave-holding class and showing how that torture and repressive slave codes and the omnipresent slave patrols instilled fear in the slave community and prevented widespread slave revolts. Because master on slave rape and the slaveholders' practice of slave breeding are never fully explored in most history books about American slavery, these matters are examined in part 2. In part 3, I discuss the breakup of the slave marital unions and slave families, taking into account what influential historians have written about the subject and also incorporating what ex-slaves have told us about it. In part 4, I address the aftermath of American slavery, arguing the post-Reconstruction 20th century and present-day forms of white violence, repression, and racial discrimination, and how they have hindered and continue to impede Black social and economic progress. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be right back.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make a enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Thank you so much, Anthony McPhail. Anthony McPhail says his sister-in-law will be joining us tonight. So thank you. And I say welcome, welcome, welcome. Scholarship on the Brutality of American Slavery is Chapter 1, and it starts with a quote from Chancellor Williams from The Destruction of Black Civilization, which we read earlier on this channel. As long as we rely on white historians to write Black history for us, we should keep silent about what they write. Slavery in America's antebellum South was a brutal regime that damaged the health of Black people. They experienced psychological and emotional trauma, but the worst damage was inflicted upon them by their white captors was physical. Ultimately, American historians as a group have been unwilling to expose the full horrors of American slavery. They have concealed the slaveholders' violent acts. Most pre-civil rights era scholarship denies that any physical cruelty ever existed and is overtly tolerant of the slaveholders' view that slavery was a benign institution. Other studies, though maintaining that American slavery was a repressive regime, give too much credence to the view that the slaveholders offered positive incentives as a primary means of securing the slaves' obedience. So what he's saying here is that in other scholarship before the Civil Rights Movement, they portrayed slavery as something that white folks cajoled us into. The want of objective scholarship on the true brutality of American slavery may be traced back to an important but racially biased study published in the early 20th century. In American Negro Slavery back in 1918, Ulrich Bonnell Phillips, who lived from 1877 to 1834, a white Southerner who was the first major historian on American slavery, denied that considerable brutality had existed under the institution. In the actual regime, severity was clearly the exception, he wrote, and kindliness was the rule. According to Phillips, American slavery was by no means a cruel and inhumane system, but on the whole, the best schools yet invented for the mass training of that sort of inert and backward people which the bulk of the American Negroes represented. At the time of his death, he stood as the foremost authority on American slavery. So this racist white man, who was probably also a eugenicist, wrote that slavery was the best way to train us. Writing during the 1940s and early 1950s, Samuel Eliot Morison, who lived from 1887 to 1976, and Henry Steele Commanger, who lived from 1902 until 1988, were also overly tolerant of the Southern view that slavery was a benign institution and Africans in America were content were content with their lot in life. In their view, Sambo suffered less than any other class in the South, and most slaves were adequately fed, well cared for, and apparently even happy. Kenneth M. Stamp's Peculiar Institution, written in 1956, was one of the first major works to challenge the view. Stamp asserted that slavery was an oppressive institution and the characteristic mode of adjustment was one of resistance. This resistance manifested itself as the slaves made themselves troublesome property. Stamp found that the typical slaveholder attempted to attempted to accustom his slave to rigid discipline, denied him unconditional submission, impressed upon him his innate inferiority, developed in him a paralyzing fear of white men, trained him to adopt the white man's code of good behavior, and instilled in him a sense of total dependence. While Stamp recognized these forms of control, he nonetheless saw religious instruction as the master's primary means of securing unconditional submission, and his benevolence as a second way. Depicting the slaveholder in this more favorable light, he placed physical coercion low on the ladder of inducement. Although Stamp conceded that bondage could not have existed without the power to torture, he focused primarily on the master's non-coercive methods of securing obedience, measures which were neither as important, as violent, nor as effective as it is in sustaining and prolonging the evil regime. So Stamp focused on the fact that, their religious instruction and the gifts that we give them and our ability to change their minds kept them enslaved. Stamp acknowledged that American slavery was characterized by violence, which is an important first step, but he did not take a stand on the degree of brutality, claiming that records were fragmentary and sometimes hinted only vaguely at conditions. As we will see, the innumerable acts of cruelty documented in both the wealth of slave testimony and travelers' contemporaneous accounts suggest that Stamps was unwilling to fully research or investigate the brutality suffered by those who he would have us believe were the voiceless solitudes. In 1959, Stanley M. Elkins published Slavery, a Problem in the American Institutional and Intellectual Life. He argued that slavery was so degrading, traumatic, and brutalizing that it caused Blacks permanent psychological damage. According to him, the Africans were what slavery had made them. A working adjustment to the institution of American slavery required a childlike conformity and a limited choice of significant others. Elkins offered what he called a Nazi concentration camp analogy, reasoning that to survive in the plantation system out of the necessity, the slave had to in some way picture his master as a good father. In his view, the mechanism that inspired devotion was not the cruelty of the parent, but rather the abnormal dependency of the child. Scholars who have completed advanced studies in the field must know that American slavery was characterized by violence. Nonetheless, though they had to be aware of the horrible torment Africans endured at the hands of their white captors, many American historians have defensively engaged in rationalization and denial. Although they have struggled to offer convincing explanations for the slaves' prolonged bondage, some are reluctant to concede that the master's physical cruelty was its chief cause. So you hear that? The reason that we were enslaved for so long was because of the threats of violence against us. Widespread acceptance was Elkins' notion that Black slaves were abnormally dependent children, promoted the belief that the blame for their continued bondage fell not on the slaveholding class, but on the Africans themselves. Nevertheless, Elkins was credited for acknowledging the brutality of American slavery. Violence was always present, It was part of the slave's daily existence. The whippings, body mutilations, and killings created real terror and fear. It implanted in Black people not a childlike devotion, kept the slave system intact. So, what he's saying is that the violence is what kept the slave system intact, not the childlike devotion that you often hear about. But when we get to the point where we don't care en masse, then they tell us that we're wrong for having uprisings, that we're wrong for coming together and saying, I would rather die than for this to continue. But that's all they understand. Continuing. In 1972, Gerald Mullen completed a provocative study titled Flight and Rebellion. He maintained that a gradual transformation of traditional African values or a cultural change made Blacks less suitable for plantation slavery. The assimilation or acculturation process gave rise to rebellious qualities in the slaves. Simply stated, Mullen suggested that Africans gained a greater appreciation for freedom and independence by adopting the culture and values of Europeans. He also believed that American slavery was a benign institution. In his study, he chose to call the slaveholder a patriarch who served as an accomplished head of an extended plantation family. Mullins, among other historians, used the word punishment to describe the horrific torture Africans endured. In the dictionary, punishment is defined as undergoing suffering, pain, or loss that serves as retribution or having a penalty inflicted or imposed on as an offender. In the context of the slave-master relationship, use of the word assigns fault to the slave as an offender. It suggests that Black people who behaved in a manner unacceptable to their white captors deserved physical correction, and it renders various forms of torture as acceptable. Once torture is recast as punishment instead of faulting the slaveholder for torturing his slaves, Mullen is able to shift his focus and surmise that one slaveholder's mischievous servants craved physical correction. The immoral slave codes of the Old South defined resistance as unnatural subjugation as an offense. But enslaved Africans in America committed no wrongdoing when they offered resistance, when they refused to passively accept their captivity. Inasmuch as American historians writing in the 1970s also gave little attention to the brutal aspects of American slavery, they underestimated the estrangement, the horror, and the violence that characterized the process of enslavement. John W. Blassingame's Slave Community, George W. Rawick's The Sundown of Sunup, From Sundown to Sunup, and Lawrence W. Levine's Black Culture and Consciousness focused on the slave's creative instinct and the cultural richness of his community. With few exceptions, American scholars had expressed the view that since slavery in the United States wiped out all linguistic and institutional aspects of African life, it also wiped out all elements of traditional West African culture. The sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, who lived from 1894 to 1962, for example, wrote, "In America, there was no social organization to sustain whatever ideas and conceptions of life the Negro slave might have retained from his African heritage." But Rawick subsequently pointed out that culture and personality are not like old clothes that can be taken off and thrown away. And Levine contended that culture can be expressed as well by something less tangible, such as a shared fundamental outlook toward the past, present, and future, and a common means of cultural expression. Undoubtedly, the slave's ordeal in America did not totally destroy his African culture. The American slavery regime did leave space for some cultural independence and a modicum of self-respect. The historian John W. Blassingame, who lived from 1940 to 2000, found that the African in America retained elements of his native tongue, native folk tales, native song and dance, and African religious rites. Indeed, he argued that the slaves were able to develop their own cultural forms of expression, and they did establish viable, culturally autonomous communities under the American slavery regime. But by focusing on the cultural richness of the slave community, these respected scholars set themselves up for the economic historian Robert W. Fogel and Stanley L. Ingerman, who, under the guise of scientific research, brazenly downplayed the slaveholders' barbarity, created a favorable picture of American slavery, and arguably defended the regime. In their opinion, whipping was a fully acceptable form of punishment. Most masters were not malicious, brutal, or sadistic, and some developed a wide-ranging system of rewards, including elaborate schemes for profit sharing with their slaves. The historian Edward D. Genovese, probably one of the foremost authorities on American slavery, also devoted less attention to the brutal aspects of slavery by focusing on the living space created for the slave by the so-called paternalistic compromise. This compromise consisted of reciprocal obligations. The slave internalized the role of a dependent child who was expected to accept punishment from his master, and his master, the parent, was expected to administer punishment non-arbitrarily and in a coolly calculated manner. The historian James Oakes elaborated on the paternalistic ethos. He said that the slaveholder believed philosophically that he was at the top of the natural, immutable, and divinely inspired social order, where he never neglected his responsibilities as the head of the household and ideally ruled his estate with generosity, providing for the material needs of family and servants, never resorting to harsh treatment. So as you can see, they have lionized themselves and put themselves in the role of a caring father. Greetings, Black Business Network. Thanks so much for tuning in. In Genovese's view, paternalism was a significant factor in keeping the American slave system intact. He missed the mark. Black people were not disobedient children. They were captives who were lawfully kept ignorant, tortured, and forced to provide labor against their will. Africans in America were powerless to revolt against a regime that gave the slaveholder license to punish his slaves savagely by whipping, mutilating, or even killing them. Although Genovese insisted that paternalism helped to prolong the survival of the American slavery regime, he did concede that masters and overseers undoubtedly murdered more slaves than we will ever know. And arrests, convictions, and punishment were never remotely kept pace with the number of victims. So what he's saying is that we were over policed even during our enslavement, and we are still over policed to this very day. If the latter is true, enslaved Blacks in the antebellum South must have found the murder of more slaves than we will ever know, a major deterrent to resistance, and a horrifying reminder of the consequences of rebellion. Downplaying the cruelty, Genovese wrote, slaves in the United States probably suffered the ultimate crime of violence less frequently than did those in other American slave societies, and white killers probably faced justice more often in the Old South than elsewhere. Yeah, right. There were historians, however, notably Rhett S. Jones, who lived from 1940 to 2008, who disagreed. Jones found that slavery was crueler in North America than it was in the Caribbean and South America, and that this cruelty grew out of the social organization that was later to become the United States. Stanley Elkins also was aware that the murder of slaves was not punishable in ways applying to white society in the antebellum South because the law prohibited Black people from testifying against white people in the courts. They also had the Fugitive Slave Act. They could kill us they could kill us during the act of correction without any legal repercussions. In 1989, Peter J. Parrish, who lived from 1929 until 2002, published Slavery, History, and Historians. He argued that the master had competing needs for profit and paternalism, which were not mutually exclusive in his mind. In defense of the master's good character, Parrish maintained that the slaveholder's relentless pursuit of profit was tempered or restrained by the conventional morality of his time, his own standards of decency, the precepts of his religious faith, and the pressure of the white community. In Parrish's view, torture and positive work incentives were combined and balanced in one system of management and discipline. Moreover, he found that the slave master's self-interest in increasing the population of his most valuable asset, his slaves, forced him to provide at least minimal material and social conditions which would encourage or at least not hinder slaves' childbearing. To his credit, Parrish acknowledged nonetheless that the use or threat of torture was fundamental to the survival of American slavery regime and all other methods, including the use of rewards and incentives, were secondary. In 2002, John C. Perry, a white Southerner, published a book called Myths and Realities of American Slavery. A disciple of Ulrich B. Phillips, he insisted that slaveholders applied no policy of brutality and asked why would they risk the potential physical harm by severely whipping their slaves. The short answer is that masters risked physically injuring their slaves because they understood that administering severe whippings was the most effective method of extracting efficient slave labor. After all, what real incentive did the slaves have to work very hard, and how else were the slaveholders going to reap the benefits of the bargain? Enslaved Black people in America felt no compulsion to overwork themselves unless forced by the application of the slave driver's lash. The slave drivers would not have commanded a profitable return on their cash investment in human property if they hadn't severely whipped their slaves. The most barbarous cruelty existed on those plantations where masters employed overseers to torture their slaves because overseers were generally ruthless in the treatment of slaves. The 90-year-old Virginia ex-slave Silas Jackson recalled that slaves were driven at top speed and whipped at the snap of a finger by overseers. The slaveholder was able to risk physically harming his slaves because he also realized that no white Southerner was going to hold him accountable for murdering them. Indeed, many masters of the antebellum South placed the health of their slaves second to the success of their harvest. There were slaveholders who whipped their slaves to death for not working as productively as they expected them to work. Remember, they had breeding farms, so they could just go make another slave. So it's also our toxic genetic trait to say, if it's okay when we spank and punish our children, it's okay, we'll beat you to death and punish you because I can make another one just like you. That's a relic, that's a carryover. Perry also contended that the more common form of motivation was not the practice of torture, but a system of rewards. Some slaves, Perry argued, participated in the forerunner of modern corporation bonus plans. The slaveholders generally shared profits with their slaves. He claimed that the most popular rewards slaveholders gave their captives at the end of each year were cash bonuses, some quite substantial. Perry, however, missed the forest for the trees. The slaves were not employees who were paid for their daily toil. The master did not bargain with or hire slave labor. He owned it and used it up. If any slave received cash bonus at the end of the year, however, substantial, as Peter Parrish noted, the reward was disproportionate to the quality and quantity of the work that he had performed. Finally, Perry would have us swallow this claim that the master promised his slaves eventual freedom for years of service, loyalty, and hard labor. But the typical slave in the antebellum South had virtually no chance of being freed by his captor. The absurdity of Perry's assertion becomes apparent if we consider, as he did, that in the year 1850, the manumission rate for slaves was only 1 to every 2,181 slaves. On the topic of slavery, American slavery, what American historians choose to focus on is important and reveals much about this craft, their perceptions, and their biases. They should be concerned with presenting a true and accurate account of American slavery and promoting a better understanding of what white Southerners euphemistically called the peculiar institution. Some are unable to do so because of their preoccupations with humanizing the slaveholder, presenting him in a more favorable light. Their apparent objective is to search out some goodness, any goodness, in the enormities, although available records clearly show that masters, their overseers, and their slave drivers were disposed to inflicting severe pain and suffering on their slaves. Certain influential American historians have insisted that brutal and inhumane slaveholders were exceptions to the general rule. To date, few American historians have raised serious questions regarding the mental competence of the people who would violently enslave hundreds of human beings because of their skin color. Most have presumed the sanity of the perpetrators of the violence. Their tendency has been to try to explain and justify the slaveholder's cruelty within the context of his society. But just 30 years ago, the psychologist Naim Akbar elaborated on this phenomenon by saying, traditional definitions of mental health in the Western world have been normative definitions. In the context of considering considerable uncertainty as to what constituted a normal human being, the kind of democratic sanity was established. This democratic sanity essentially applied to the social political definition of the majority rule to the definition of adequate human functioning. As a result, insane behavior is determined to be on the basis of the degree to which it derives and it deviates from the majority's behavior in a given context. The consequence of such democratic sanity is that the entire communities of raving, inhumane lunatics have been adjudged sane and competent because the majority of the people in that particular context either participated in the questionable behavior or refused to question the questionable behavior. So, in other words, standards become normalized and abnormal things become normal because everybody in the society is crazy. Akbar suggested that one group of people's pernicious oppression of another group merely because the former perceives as a difference in skin color of the latter has not been studied by the world's psychologists. In fact, notable scholars of the past who had studied racism were either reluctant or found it a difficult challenge to give serious consideration to its origins and to the concomitant hostility. They were content to study the peculiarly established patterns of racism. So, as you can see, white people do a lot in writing their books and justifying in our enslavement. They do a lot and continue to do a lot to humanize the slaveholders, paying little to no attention to the enslaved person. They do a lot to make sure that their white Southern brethren are put in a position of where they believe that they were just poor planters that loved and cared for their slaves and not these horrible, malicious, malevolent bastards that wanted more money and more power. And we're going to read chapter 2, a monopoly of violence in the slaveholder's hand. And it starts with a quote by William Whipper. If a man's superiority over the brute creation consists only in his reasoning powers of rationality of mind, his various methods of practicing violence toward his fellow creatures has in many cases placed him on a level with, and sometimes below, many species of the quadrupled race. So basically, you're an animal because you practice this violence. Some American slavery historians, such as Ulrich B. Phillips, for example, believe that the master-slave relationship was built upon a reciprocal, benevolent concern for each party's interest or well-being, something more morally acceptable than a monopoly of violence in the slaveholder's hands. The relationship, however, was one created and maintained through torture. The slave was a captive. If he had escaped, where would have been his hideout for protection? He might have found temporary refuge in the woods, but slave resistance was vigorously suppressed. It was quelled not just by the individual power of violence in the slave owner hands, but by the social and collective community power that had nothing to do with the master's so-called paternalistic concern for the well-being of his slaves. Thus, the absence of widespread insurrection among enslaved Black people in the antebellum South was neither due to an abnormal dependency on their part, nor attributed to a delicate fabric of implicit reciprocal duties accepted by both master and slaves. Nor can we credit it to a calculated, balanced system of torture and rewards. This is not to suggest that all slaveholders subjected their slaves to physically injurious treatment. Some masters who did not believe in whipping their rebellious slaves simply put them in their pocket, selling them and separating them from their loved ones. Nevertheless, as an ex slave, Harriet Jacobs noted humane slaveholders were like angels, visits few and far between. Only through a clearer understanding of the coercive apparatus developed in the Old South will we better understand the absence of widespread insurrection. In the United States, slave owners violently forced Africans into what the historian Angela Y. Davis called a patently unnatural subjugation. She elaborated, if the slaveholders had not maintained an absolute monopoly of violence, if they had not been able to rely on large numbers of their fellow white men to assist them in their terrorist machinations, slavery would have been far less feasible than it actually proved to be. For many of the ex-slave interviews recorded in the 1930s and virtually all of the slave narratives published before the American Civil War document the violence slaveholders used to repress slave resistance. Not only do these acts of torture appear frequently in the slave narratives, they seem central to slave life. We may divide the forms of repression used by the slaveholding class to subjugate Black slaves during the antebellum period into three major categories: torture on the plantations, legally sanctioned repression, and repression by the omnipresent slave patrols surrounding the plantations. Torture on the plantations. The first form of repression was the torture of the slaves on the plantations, the method of which was left totally to the discretion of the slaveholders. They employed a variety of means to torture their captives. The ex-slave William Wells Brown noted that one of his masters tied him up in a smokehouse and whipped him. After this, he made a fire and smoked him. This was called Virginia play. In the following passage, Charles Ball provided an account of a practice of torture called cat hauling, a sadistic instance with a slaveholder took a large gray tomcat, placed it upon the bare back of a prostrate bondsman, and forcibly dragged the cat by the tail from the man's shoulder down his back and along his bare thigh. And he quotes, "The cat sunk his nails into the flesh and tore off pieces of skin with his teeth. The man roared with pain of this punishment. This was the most excruciating punishment I have ever saw inflicted on Black people, and it's very dangerous, for the claws of the cat are poisonous, and wounds made by them are very subject to inflammation." Another form of torture was the sweat box. The South Carolina ex-slave Prince Smith told us that the sweat box was made the height of the slave and no larger, just large enough so he wouldn't have to squeeze in. The slaveholder would force his slave to get in the box and he would then nail it shut. In summer, he would place the box in the hot sun. In the winter, he would put it in the coldest, dampest place. Mary Ella Granberry, a former slave from Alabama, referred to a similar form of torture as the nigger box. The master drilled air holes into the box to keep his slave from suffocating. Granberry said, "If and you had done a bigger enough thing, you was kept in the nigger box for months at a time. And then when you got out, if you was nothing but skin and bones and scarcely able to walk." Writing between 1824 and 1835, the traveler Nehemiah Calkins recorded that he saw another slave who was buried up to his chin, his arms being secured down by his sides, and was kept in this position 4 or 5 days. Sarah Ross, a Mississippi ex-slave, recalled that slaveholders found no kind of torture too cruel or severe to inflict upon their captives. She said, frequently the thighs of male slaves were gashed with a saw, and salt was put in the wound. That was to keep them from running away. The cat o' nine tails. The most frequent form of torture was the lash, commonly referred to by ex-slaves as the cat o' nine tails, meaning that every lash produced 9 licks. The cat o' nine tails was a whip of 9 leather straps attached to a stick. On some, the leather straps were braided. On others, they were perforated so that everywhere the hole in the strap came in contact with the flesh, it would leave a blister. Often, after a severe whipping, typically performed by an overseer or a slave driver, the slave's raw and open wounds would be treated with water containing salt. The slaveholders called this treatment the saltwater cure, but it cured nothing. It merely aggravated the slave's pain and made it last longer. John Perry found little historical data on whippings to examine. Nonetheless, the revered historian John Hope Franklin, who lived from 1915 until 2009, noted that efforts at statistical computation of whippings are pointless, if not ridiculous. He charged that in an effort to get work out of his slaves, the master frequently used the bullwhip. Almost no slaveholders disclaimed whipping as an effective form of torture, and the excessive use of the lash was one of the most egregious abuses of the American slavery regime. Information gathered from the slave narratives reveals that no matter how good or useful the slave was, he seldom escaped the lash. The Texas ex-slave Katie Darling remembered that when a slave did anything, the master bullwhipped him. She said he'd whip the man for half doing the plows or hoeing, but if he had done it right, he'd find something else to whip him for. The former slave Henry Bibb's master kept no overseer on his plantation who didn't perform the duty every morning. I've heard him say, wrote Bibb, that he was no better pleased than when he could hear the sound of the driver's lash among the toiling slaves. Dennis Sims, an ex-slave from Maryland, also recalled that slaves had to toe the mark or be flogged with a rawhide whip. Almost every day on the plantation, there was some form of 10 thrashings to given to disobedient slaves. The 90-year-old North Carolina ex-slave Andrew Boone described in graphic detail how the slaveholders used the cat o' nine tails to torture him and other slaves. And he says, I saw a lot of slaves whipped, and I was whipped myself. They whipped me with the cat o' nine tails. It had 9 lashes on it. Some of the slaves was whipped with a cobbling paddle. They had 40 holes in them. When you was bucked into a barrel, they hit you naked flesh with the paddle, and everywhere was a hole in the paddle, it drawed a blister. When the whipping with the paddle was over, they took the cat o' nine tails and busted the blisters. By this time, the blood sometimes would be running down their heels. Then the next thing was a wash in salt water strong enough to hold up an egg. Slaves was punished that way for running away and such. Over 90 years at the time of his over 90 years old at the time of his interview, Henry Johnson, a former slave from Virginia, recalled vivid memories of the paddle and the lash. He said, "Slaves have been stripped naked and lashed often to death. They would be left strapped after from 25 to 50 lashes every 2 or 3 hours to stand there all night. The next day, the overseer would be back with a heavy paddle full of holes that had been dipped in boiling water and beat until the whole body was full of blisters. Then he'd take the cat o' nine tails dipped in hot salt water to draw out the bruised blood and would open every one of those blisters with that. If the slave did not die from that torture, he would be unfastened from the whipping post and made to go to the field just as he was. Oftentimes he would die shortly after." Slaves did not have to commit infractions to be whipped. Barney Stone, a former slave from Kentucky, said that he saw his mother beaten mercilessly by his master for no good reason. The Oklahoma ex-slave John White, who lived to be 121 years old when he was interviewed, exclaimed, "Master Presley used his whip all the time, reason or no reason. I got scars to remember by." The Arkansas ex-slave J.T. Timms similarly told us, "When old Miss was whipping me, I asked her what she was whipping me for, and she said nothing, 'cause you're mine and 'cause I can whip you if I want to." A former slave from Missouri named James Simpson also recalled that her mistress whipped her when she had done nothing wrong. Thus, slaveholders whipped blacks in the antebellum South not only for running away or lagging behind in their labor. It was not enough that the master controlled the labor of his slaves. Psychopolitical motives fueled the slave owner's acts of cruelty as well. His objectives were twofold: convince Black people that they were innately inferior, less human, and impress upon them a sense of his enormous power. Certain slaveholders and slave drivers whipped obedient slaves to vent anger. Others found whipping them a source of perverse gratification. J.T. Timms recalled that his mistress whipped him because she was mad at that day, and he was around, so she took it out on him. Jane Simpson said that if her mistress got mad about something, just anything at all, she would whip her just to satisfy her spite feeling. Touring the rice and sugar plantations of the Deep South in 1830, a traveler named Simon Ansley Farrell noted that there was a fact well known to persons who have visited slave countries, that torture was more frequently inflicted to gratify the private pique or caprice of the slave driver than for a crime or neglect of duty. Slaveholders, overseers, and slave drivers whipped obedient slaves because they commanded unlimited power to do it. They were also mindful that the frequent use of violence instilled fear in their slaves, and that was essential to securing total control. We have to rely more and more on power of fear, wrote one slaveholder. We are determined to continue as masters, he noted, and to do so, we have to draw the rein tighter and tighter day by day to be assured that we hold them in complete check. So as you can see, they continued to own violence. They continued to have a monopoly on violence. And they continued to assert their power and control over these enslaved people. Anthony McPhail said, because I own you and I can do whatever I want to you, the indoctrination of mental slavery. Absolutely, that's the indoctrination of mental slavery. That's the whole purpose of mental slavery. They continue in this sick and twisted belief that because they are in control and because they have the power over life and death in their hands, that they can, and that is epigenetically bred into white people that have ties to America. They believe that they can do whatever they want. They white and they say so. And they believe that they own us and that they should own us. They believe that they believe that they should be in a position of power and control all the time. And they're willing to do anything to keep that control. All right, we're going to go on to chapter 3. These chapters are short, which is why I'm blasting through them so fast. So they're only 2 or 3 pages long. So we're going to try to get through the whole first section tonight. The slave's undying faith in God starts with a verse, Psalms 34:4. I prayed to the Lord, and he answered me, freeing me from all my fears. When it came to their slaves, the slaveholders had 2 approaches to the Bible: keep it away from them and try to use it as a weapon of indoctrination. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution in part states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. With that in mind, some of us might find a difficulty in accepting the following premise in the United States of America, a country founded upon the principle of religious freedom. One group of people forcibly prevented another group of people from worshiping God, but the First Amendment did not undertake to protect even the religious liberty of white people against the action of their respective state governments. And in an effort to control the soul and break the independent religious spirit of Africans, the slaveholders of the antebellum South were determined to keep them ignorant of the Bible unless it promoted his self-interest. The slave master saw the danger inherent in his slaves' worship of God. The Arkansas ex-slave Lucretia Alexander recalled always hearing the same sermon from a Baptist preacher. She said, the preacher came to preach to the slaves in their quarters. He'd say, serve your masters. Don't steal your master's turkey. Don't steal your master's chicken. Don't steal your master's hogs. Don't steal your master's meat. Do so whatever your master tells you to do. Same old thing all the time. Interviewed in 1936, the 108-year-old Florida, who was an ex-slave, Father Charles Coates, also a 108-year-old Florida ex-slave named Father Charles Coates, also recalled a white minister instructing him not to steal, as well as not to lie or run away, and to be sure and get all them weeds out of the corn and the field, and your master will think a heap of you. Coates remembered nothing else the preacher told him. He learned more about God outside of the church. Hannah Austin, a former slave from Georgia, said that the slaves on her plantation seldom heard a true religious sermon. Instead, they were instructed to obey their masters and mistresses. So this is why I say religion is indoctrination. Fearful of their owners, some black ministers gave sermons that were no different from those of the white preachers. John White told us that an old black preacher on his plantation just talked about the master and mistress, how the slaves must obey around the plantation, how white folks know what is good for the slaves. The black minister said nothing about obeying God and working for him. White exclaimed, I reckon the old preacher was worrying more about the bullwhip than he was the Bible, else he say something about the Lord. The anti-slavery advocate, Reverend William Goodell, explained that the master's claim on his slave extended to the slave's soul as well as his body. Otherwise, the body could not have been held and controlled. Through religious instruction, the slaveholders tried to convince their slaves that slavery enjoyed divine sanction. It was commanded by the Bible, and if the slaves led a life of loyal servitude, eternal salvation would be their reward. I'll insert here, trust no man that teaches you to look for your reward outside of this life. Trust no man that teaches you to look for your reward outside of this life. So I lost my place. Give me one moment. So if they led a life of loyal servitude, eternal salvation would be their reward. The slaves, however, were not convinced. William Ward, a 105-year-old ex-slave from Georgia, said, none of the slaves believed this, although they pretended to believe because of the presence of the white overseer. Most slaves realized that the master's lesson was a misrepresentation and perversion of God's word. Reverend Goodell hardly could have faulted them for their skepticism. In 1853, he wrote, it is no discredit to the slaves that they have little or no desire to hear religious harangues from their oppressors, and that they loathe the instructions of ministers who preach the righteousness of slaveholding. The English poet and philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge noted, by a principle essential to Christianity, a person is eternally differenced from a thing, so that the idea of a human being necessarily excludes the idea of property in that being. Coleridge revealed the contradiction of professing to be a Christian and owning slaves. Evangelical Protestantism, a religious faith followed by many slaveholders, promoted egalitarianism and explicitly rejected materialism. If those masters were not mindful that their faith was clearly at odds with slaveholding, the sole purpose of which was to amass wealth at the expense of brutally dehumanizing their captives, the slaves' dogged refusal to succumb to their slaveholders' use of Christianity as a weapon of indoctrination was an enduring reminder to those slaveholders of that contradiction. So even in their religion, they had a contradiction of thought and idea, because how are you holding people as slaves and as property for profit when your religion teaches you piety and teaches you not to covet the things of this world? Hi, Shanique Ford. Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate you for being here. The slave suffered physically, but compared to his captor, he believed that he was more righteous, albeit practically speaking, powerless one. He was a spiritual being, and he was spiritually grounded. Resistance to slavery his master feared. In fact, the North Carolina ex-slave W.L. Post said, White folks feared for niggas to get any religion. Slaveholders were apprehensive of permitting their slaves to have unsupervised religious instruction because they were concerned that it would enlighten them, teach them that all human beings were created equal in the eyes of God, and that any system of governance that supports the enslavement and dehumanization of a people because of the color of their skin is evil, immoral, and not Christian. Greetings, Sister Raw. Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate you and the elders for being here. Some masters also worried that if the slaves were left alone to choose their own modes and forms of religious worship, it might lead to insubordination, or worse, to insurrection. For surely most members of the slaveholding class knew that over 50 of their own people had been killed in Southampton County, Virginia during the Nat Turner insurrection of August 21st through 23rd, 1831. Moreover, they understood that Nat Turner himself, free of fear, believed that he had been commanded by God to give a death blow to those intent on protecting and preserving the evil and immoral American slavery regime. As far as the slaveholding class was concerned, Black religious freedom was incompatible with slavery, but slaves' undying faith in God was one no captor could take away. The 100-year-old Alabama ex-slave Delia Garlick recalled that trusting in the Lord was the only hope the slaves had in those days. She said, "Us just prayed for strength to endure it to the end." Some slaves would steal away and attend night prayer meeting, though those meetings were prohibited by the slave codes. They appreciated the dangers of attending those religious services. Charlotte Martin, a former slave from Florida, told us that her master whipped her oldest brother to death for taking part in a secret night prayer meeting, and that the cruel act halted further clandestine religious services. Silas Jackson also remembered a master who murdered his slave for praying. The slaveholder overheard a slave named Zeke praying in his cabin one night. Zeke asked God to change his master's heart and to deliver him from slavery so that he might enjoy freedom. He disappeared before sun rose, never to be seen again. Although the slaves claimed they could still hear Zeke praying down in the swamp on certain nights of the month, on his deathbed, his master confessed to a Baptist minister that he had killed him for praying. The dying slaveholder foretold that he himself was going to hell because of it. Other slaves realized that slave patrols were predisposed to disrupt religious gatherings. W.L. Post said, "Sometimes the patty rollers catch us and beat us good, but that didn't keep us from trying." He recalled memories of his mother singing and praying to God to deliver them from bondage. The Alabama ex-slave Mingo White remembered as well that after the slaves completed their day's work, they locked themselves in their cabins, praying to the Lord to free them like he did with the children of Israel. Several former slaves gave various accounts of their practice of using large empty pots to keep the slave patrols and slaveholders from overhearing their singing and praying. The ex-Virginia slave Minnie Folks, for example, said that her mother informed her that the slaves used to have meetings and sing and pray, and the old patty rollers would hear them, so they keep the sound from going out. Slaves would put a great big iron pot at the door, Folks added. Sometimes they would forget to pull the old pot down, and the patty rollers would come and horsewhip every last one of them just because the poor souls was praying to God to free them from that awful bondage. North Carolina and Arkansas ex-slave Henry Bobbitt and Cyrus Bellis recalled that other slaves turned the kettles in their cabins bottom up in the belief that the masters could not overhear them singing and praying. The Arkansas ex-slave Rachel Fairley's mother told her that before praying for freedom, she put her head under a large cooking pot. Cooking pot or not, some slaveholders severely whipped slaves whom they caught praying. Mingo White commented on an incident involving an old slave named Ned White. He said that the following happened to Ned when his master caught him praying. The drivers took him the next day and carried him to the pegs, what was 4 stakes drove into the ground. Ned was made to pull off everything but his pants and lay on his stomach between the pegs while somebody strapped his legs and arms to the pegs. Then they whipped him till the blood run from him like he was a hog. They made all the hands come out and see it, and they said us get the same thing if us get caught. They don't allow a man to whip a horse like they whipped him in them days. Many folks who recollected the impious masters beat and whipped their captives severely to prevent them from serving the Lord. She said they would come in and start whipping and beating the slaves unmerciful. All this was done to keep you from serving God. And do you know, some of them devils was mean and sinful enough to say, if I catch you serving God, I'll beat you. You ain't having time to serve God. We brought you here to serve us. Convinced that eventually those slaveholders would have to answer to the Lord for their immoral transgressions, many folks predicted God gonna rod them wicked masters, and if it ain't, then that's what he gets. Hits gonna fall harder on their children. Celestia Avery remembered the cruel treatment her grandmother Sylvia Hurd received when she prayed. She said, every morning my grandmother would pray, and old man Hurd despised to hear anyone pray, saying that they were only doing so that they might become free niggers. Just as sure as the sun would rise, she would get a whipping, but this did not stop her prayers every morning before the day. In spite of the master's torture, Celestia Avery's grandmother, she remained undaunted. Notwithstanding her owner's enormous power, the whippings did not stop her daily prayers because the spiritual woman's strong faith and trust in God, her true master, gave her the strength, courage, and will to endure. With the Lord by her side, Sylvia Hurd conquered her fear. As for her captor, she believed that his judgment day was near. So you see how we used religion and our spirituality? We used our religion and our spirituality to strengthen our faith, to be more resilient. And this is why Dr. Kobe Cambone talks about the fact that we are spiritual beings having a physical experience. And he talks about the fact that we have to use our spirituality as a tool for our liberation. Shanique Ford, I'm glad you're here too. You didn't miss a lot. You missed the first couple of chapters, but I'm reading a few more chapters tonight. The torture of Black women and children. Black women were as powerless, vulnerable, and fearful as Black men, inasmuch as they too were tortured. Nancy Bowdry, a former slave from Georgia, said, they whooped me bad, pull all the clothes down to my waist, my master did. Slaveholders whipped female slave cooks almost to death for such minor omissions as oversight as forgetting to put onions in the stew and burning the bread. Olive Gilbert, the author who recorded the narrative of the ex-slave and human rights advocate Sojourner Truth, who lived from 1797 to 1883, noted that the latter remembered being whipped by her master till the flesh was deeply lacerated and the blood streamed from her wounds, and the scars remain to the present day to testify to the fact. And now, exclaimed Truth, when I hear 'em tell of whipping women on the bare flesh, it makes my flesh crawl and my very hair rise on my head. Southern white women also whipped black women sadistically and brutally. In his autobiography, The Former Slave, James L. Smith wrote about Miss Mitchell, a heartless mistress who whipped a slave woman named Jenny in a very cruel manner. She would apply a rawhide to her back until she had exhausted her own strength, wrote Smith. She would rest for a few minutes while keeping Jenny standing, and after resting her weary arms, she commenced again, thus whipped and rested until she had applied 50 blows upon her suffering back. Mistress Mitchell then sent Jenny back to the kitchen to work with her back sore and bleeding. Gilbert also noted that Sojourner Truth has seen a mistress of high social standing actually beating the skull of the slave woman called Tabby, and not content with that, had her tied up and whipped after her skull was broken. The victim of unrestrained physical cruelty died hanging to the bedstead to which she had been fastened. Slave parents could not shield their children from the wrath of the mistress. 91-year-old Texas ex-slave Mary Armstrong was owned by an evil mistress called Old Polly Cleveland. Old Polly, in her opinion, was one of the meanest white folks that ever lived, said Mary Armstrong. Old Polly, she was a Polly devil, if there ever was one. She whipped my little sister, what was only 9 months old and just a baby, to death. She came and took the diaper off of my little sister and whipped till the blood just ran. Just 'cause she cried like all babies do, and it killed my sister. Stories like this are in a book called They Were Her Property, because we overlook sometimes the white woman's role in slavery. Pregnancy and motherhood, though essential to the prosperity of the American slavery regime, provided no shelter under which the pregnant or nursing bondwoman could hide or avoid torture. Father Charles Coates said that the pregnant slave received no more leniency than the bondsman. Like the male slave, she routinely was required to work from sunup to sundown, a 12 to 13-hour workday, 6 days a week. On the cotton plantations in the antebellum South, each slave generally was expected to pick at least 150 pounds of cotton a day. Bondsmen and bondswomen alike suffered under the repressive American slavery regime because the slaveholder demanded the same of both. Under constant supervision, pregnant women performing long, fatiguing labor. In his conversations with James G. Birney in 1834, the slaveholder and U.S. Kentucky Senator Henry Clay described an overseer in Louisiana who worked his slaves so closely that one bondswoman gave birth to a child while engaged in the labors of the field. Sam and Louisa Noor Everett, ex-slaves from Norfolk, Virginia, also remarked that expectant slave mothers toiled in the fields until they felt their labor pains, and that it was not uncommon for their babies to be born in the fields. Expectant slave mothers worked hard in those fields under the threat of bodily harm. Indeed, many slaveholders saw nothing morally repugnant about torturing pregnant slaves who could not keep up with the other field hands. Sarah Ross recalled that certain masters' instructed their overseers to torture them by whipping them about the shoulders, but not so much in pity as for the protection of the slaveholders' unborn property interests. According to her granddaughter, one slave woman who was in the family way was seized, stripped, tied to a young sapling, and whipped so brutally that her body was raw all over. These violent acts against expectant nursing mothers were not infrequent. The ex-slave Moses Grandy provided a detailed account of how the overseer on his plantation tortured slave mothers with nursing babies and others who were pregnant. Those women who had suckling children, much from their breasts becoming full of milk, the infants being left home, they therefore could not keep up with the other hands. I have seen the overseer beat them rawhide, so the blood and milk flew mingled from their breasts. The woman who gives offense in the field and is large in the family way is compelled to lie down over a hole made to receive the corpulency and is flogged with a whip or beat with a paddle, which has holes in it. At every hole is a blister. One of my sisters was so severely punished in this way that labor was brought on and the child was born in the field. One overseer actually tortured a pregnant slave to death. The Mississippi ex-slave Clara C. Young saw him whip her pregnant cousin until she bled. She was just 17 years old and in the family way for the first time and couldn't work as hard as the rest, said Young. Her pregnant cousin died the following morning from the whipping. So as you can see, they did not have any regard for our women. And you want to marry this white man. And you want to have babies with this white man. Public whippings, a terrible part of living. Most masters and overseers administered public whippings and forced all their slaves to attend. Consequently, the slaves were terrified when they saw the suffering and heard the horrible screams of their brutalized brothers and sisters. For example, when the Oklahoma ex-slave Esther Easter observed a runaway slave boy chained to a whipping post, she was full of misery when she saw the lash cutting deep into the boy's skin. Susan Hamilton, a 101-year-old ex-slave from South Carolina, commented on the terror she experienced from the brutality she saw. She said, "When any slave was whipped, all the other slaves was made to watch. I see women hung from the ceiling of a building and whipped with only something tied around her lower part of the body until they were taken down. There wasn't breath in her body. I saw some terribly bad experiences." So they tied us to the roof, to the ceiling from the beam and beat us. And they used this form of torture and violence as a way to instill fear in the rest of us. On those plantations where slave hands were not compelled to watch the brutal whippings, they still heard them. Delia Garlick said, folks a mile away could hear those awful whippings. They was a terrible part of living. The Texas ex-slave Louis Bonner also recalled hearing the slaves on nearby plantations hollering from their whippings. Another former slave from Texas, named Sam Kilgore, similarly said that the slaves on his plantation behaved because they would overhear the slaves on neighboring plantations pleading when they were whipped, "Massa, Lord have mercy," and such. They were subjected to pain so that it not only seared their flesh, wrote one historian named Nathan Huggins, but that their cries would make the skin of others crawl. As we can see, the mere sound of torture instilled in the slaves a paralyzing fear of their masters. The historian Herbert Apotheker observed that most slaveholders urged an out-and-out policy of blood and iron. In those difficult circumstances, the slaves could turn nowhere for protection, as all the power was concentrated in the hands of their oppressors. Masters murdered the incalculable number of slaves. For stealing, a North Carolina slave endured 100 lashes a day for 9 days, but on the 9th day he died. After the owner of the Texas ex-slave Ben Simpson encountered trouble in Georgia, he brought 2 horses and a covered wagon and made his slaves walk all the way to Texas. In the following excerpt from his narrative, Simpson gave a horrific account of his mother's death. "Massa have a great long whip plaited out of raw hide, and when the niggers fall behind or give out, he hit them with the whip. My mother, she give out on the way, 'bout the line to Texas. Her feet got raw and bleeding. Her legs swole plumb out of shape. Then massa, he just take out the gun and he shoot her. And while she lay dying, he kick her 2 or 3 times and say, 'Damn nigga, what can't stand nothing. Boss, you know that man, he wouldn't bury mother. He just leave her there, laying where he shot her.'" Travelers from the North observed slave whippings as well. While in North Carolina between 1824 and 1835, Nehemiah Calkins of Waterford, Connecticut noted, "Scarcely a day passed while I was on the plantation in which some slaves were not whipped. I do not mean that they were struck a few blows merely, but had set a flogging." Overwhelmed by the torture and suffering she saw in South Carolina, the Northern Observer, Miss A.M. French, wrote, "Every face, everything bears the impress of it. In this dark land, torture has been a science perfecting for a long, long, weary years. We had determined as far as possible to avoid description of sufferings, for adequately to do it is impossible. Accordingly, no instance is given but to illustrate some principle. Still, many instances are pressing upon our mind and important to the true picture of slavery here. Slaveholders have shown out their true character, and now these facts are patent here. We sincerely regret and blush for shame that we must speak so of our countrymen. If the master did not whip his slaves for lagging behind in their labor, he whipped them as a matter of course, as a way of keeping keeping the system intact. Restricted by his imagination only, the slaveholder used all forms of violence to maintain full control. Most slaves were publicly whipped, but others were publicly hanged, burned at the stake, broken on the wheel, and their hands paraded on poles before their oppressed brothers and sisters. Slaveholders amputated slaves' fingers, toes, and ears as well. Although the latter forms of torture did not render those slaves unable to work, the sight of that torture created fear in the hearts of their brothers and sisters. Treatment too awful to tell. We probably would encounter difficulty finding a pro-slavery writer who would not have downplayed the horrors of American slavery. On the other side, many former slaves were no more inclined to reveal their brutal treatment or to exaggerate the number and severity of their whippings. In some of the federally funded WPA interviews conducted during the 1930s, former slaves were disposed to concealing the brutality. Perhaps they were tight-lipped because they feared retribution. After all, the interviews were conducted over 70 years ago in the Jim Crow South. At that time, convinced that many former slaves only privately revealed the horrors of American slavery, the 90-year-old ex-Texas slave Martin Jackson said, "Lots of old slaves close the door before they tell the truth about their slavery days. When the doors open, they tell how kind their masters were and how rosy it was. You can't blame them for this because they had plenty of early discipline, making them cautious about saying anything uncomplimentary about their masters." Perhaps other elderly ex-slaves were less than forthright about their treatment because they simply did not want to expose the younger interviewers to the unspeakable torture they had endured. For example, the Georgia ex-slave Molly Kinsley said, "Oh, you is blessed to live in a day when we don't have the tortures the slaves went through." Susan McIntosh, another former slave from Georgia, similarly told her interviewer, "There ain't no need to think of them times now." The comments of the 95-year-old Virginia ex-slave Elizabeth Sparks are indicative of the sentiments of the others interviewed. She remarked, "Well, I can tell you, but I ain't sure y'all pass now, so I'll say let her rest. It's too awful to tell anyway." When her interviewer questioned her about the severity of the torture, Sparks replied, "You're too young to know all that talk anyway. Well, I'll tell you some to put in your book, but I ain't gonna tell you the worst." So as you can see, it's possible that during the writers' projects, they lied and didn't tell the whole truth about their enslavement and about the different things that they went through. We only have 2 more chapters to go and then we can talk about it. 2 more chapters to go and then we can talk about it. Let me know what you think. White Man's Law, Black Man's Grief is chapter 6, and it starts with a quote by Frederick Douglass. "There is a law above all statutes, written on the heart, and by that law, unchangeable and eternal, no man can be or hold a slave." While the torture of slaves on the plantation was the first way of controlling the slave population, slaveholder created legal constraints were the second way. Laws enacted through the South during the late 18th and early 19th centuries by the slaveholding class, commonly referred to as the slave codes, defined the legal relationship between the master and his slave. It was important to understand that the slave was not a person in the eyes of the law. He was chattel, the master's personal property. Since he was not considered a person, the slave codes neither afforded him protection nor were intended to give him any. The fact of the matter is, the slaveholding class enacted laws for its own protection. By 1860, slave owners constituted 3/4 of the Deep South legislators and 2/3 of the Upper South legislators. As an unparalleled political force, they not only made the law, but they tried the offenders and administered penalties. With their acquired political and economic power, they shaped the legal system to their interests and in that process created the Southern view compatible with their regime. The judicial system became the instrument by which the slaveholding class tried to impose their viewpoint upon the wider society, not excluding the slaves themselves. The goal was to make slavery so acceptable that no Southerner would question it. Thus, those who questioned it or disturbed the regime would become enemies of Southern white society itself. Does that sound familiar? Sound like something that's happening right now? They hold 2/3 of the Upper South and they hold 2/3 majority in the House and in the Senate. No, they don't have quite 2/3 majority, but they have simple majorities in both the House and the Senate, and they hold the presidency, and they're trying to bend the legal system to their will. That's what they're doing to this day. Southern states passed laws prohibiting the circulation of abolitionist literature and outlawing the discussion of anti-slavery doctrines. The slaveholding class then used those laws to stifle anti-slavery opinion and discourage slave resistance. In the antebellum South, the white man's law was the black man's grief. Slave codes empowered the slaveholder and silenced the slave, rendering the latter powerless. The laws gave the master license, indeed made it his duty to torture his slaves toward an end of securing total unconditional submission, while they prohibited slaves from complaining about the inhumane treatment. In examining slave codes throughout the antebellum South, we find 3 common threads. The first is that they prevented slaves and free persons of color from testifying against any white person. The former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote, "Laws for the protection of the lives of the slave are utterly incapable of being enforced where the very parties who are nominally protected are not permitted to give evidence in courts of law against the only class of persons from whom abuse, outrage, and murder might reasonably be apprehended." So we couldn't even talk about the atrocities that they were bringing on us because it was illegal to give testimony. Slave codes in the state of North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Maryland, Tennessee, and even the free state of Ohio forbade blacks, slaves, and free from testifying against whites. One example of such law is the following Commonwealth of Virginia Slave Code. As Negro and mulatto, bond or free, shall be a good witness in pleas of the Commonwealth for or against Negroes or mulattoes, bond or free, or in civil pleas where the free Negroes or mulatto shall alone be parties and in no other cases whatever. So what they said is black people can sue black people or mulattoes, and mulattoes can sue black people or mulattoes, but neither class of people, be them free or otherwise, cannot sue white people. So they had the complexion for the protection. It's laws like this that they're talking about. The forecast says free states didn't mean equal rights. It absolutely did not mean equal rights. Though a slave code in South Carolina and Louisiana and a Louisiana slave code out of 1816 also prevented blacks from testifying against whites, modification of the law in those states enacted purportedly to give slaves at least some protection against malicious acts committed by a master and resulting in a slave's loss of life, limb, or member, still gave protection to cruel masters and overseers. Those slave codes stated that where no white person saw a slaveholder take his slave's life, limb, or member, or where no white person was willing to testify against the owner or other persons having charge of the slave was deemed guilty and punished unless that owner or other person could make the contrary appear by good and sufficient evidence or by his own oath clear and exculpate himself. The court administering the oath exercised its authority and acquitted the alleged offender once clear proof of the offense had not been offered by at least two witnesses. Otherwise said, if, for example, a master maliciously murdered his slave, he could clear himself of the charge by testifying on his own behalf that he did not do it maliciously, or he could avoid punishment if no more than one white witness came forward and testified to the contrary. Since the slave codes prohibited slaves from testifying against whites and therefore precluded them from supplying the required evidence that a master maliciously murdered his slave, in most instances, that master was beyond the reach of the law. The second common thread among slave codes enacted in most southern states was a provision permitting a master to murder his slave and to avoid punishment if the slave resisted his command. In 1798 and 1799, the states of North Carolina and Tennessee respectively passed laws permitting the murder of any slave in the act of resistance to his lawful owner and master, or any slave dying under moderate correction. Under North Carolina law, an owner who maliciously killed his slave could suffer the same punishment as if he had killed a free man, but only on the condition that a white person saw the act and was willing to testify against him. So only if a white person was also on your side could you have any standing in court to get justice for your death at the hands of your master. The Georgia Constitution of 1798 sanctioned the murder of any slave in case of insurrection of said slave, or if such death should happen by accident in giving such slave moderate correction. Thus, under Georgia law, we also find that if a master murdered a rebellious or accidentally whipped a slave to death through moderate correction, he incurred no penalty. One example of the law's ineffectiveness in protecting slaves' lives was provided by the Georgia ex-slave Shade Richards. He told us that his owner's son, Mr. Jimmy, often whipped his slaves to death but he was never prosecuted. In fact, Richard said that his uncle was murdered in that manner by his master's son. Similar to North Carolina law, under Georgia law, if a white witness saw a slaveholder maliciously dismember a slave or maliciously deprive him of life, and that witness testified successfully against the slave owner, the slaveholder suffered the same punishment as would have been inflicted on him had he committed the same offense upon a free white person. Slave murder laws created in the states of Alabama in 1819, Missouri in 1820, and Texas in 1845 were patterned on Georgia's model. A South Carolina Act of 1740 permitted any person in a southern heat of passion or by undue correction to kill his own slave or the slave of any person, so long as they forfeited the sum of 350 pounds. As amended in 1821, the South Carolina Act increased the penalty for killing a slave in sudden heat or by undue correction to $500 or imprisonment for 6 months. We might ask, what was undue correction? If it was the correction that was not warranted or excessive correction, who determined whether or not correction was unwarranted or excessive? Since we know that the slaves had no say in the matter, we may postulate that if a slaveholder in South Carolina after the year of 1821 were to kill his slave in a sudden heat of passion, or were to unduly correct him by whipping or beating him to death in the absence of a white witness, the slaveholder probably wouldn't have been imprisoned or fined. In the exceptional circumstance where another white person would have seen the act and been willing to testify against him, the penalty permitting the master to murder his slave would have been only $500 or imprisonment for 6 months. Laws against the mistreatment of slaves were not only ineffective in deterring murderous treatment, they were not rigorously enforced. Frederick Douglass noted that though he had heard of numerous murders committed by slave owners in East Coast Maryland, he never knew a solitary instance in which the slaveholder was either hung or imprisoned for having murdered a slave. In the final analysis, enslaved Black people in the antebellum South could not look to the laws for protection from the capricious and crueltiness of their owners. Insofar as slave codes throughout the antebellum South permitted a master to murder his slave and avoid punishment, the third common thread among these codes was that they made the slave entirely subject to the owner's will. They allowed the master to do just about anything he wanted to do with his slave, and that slave had to obey his command. Given that, we might imagine of all of the uses to which human chattel were put by the slaveholder, with the exception of South Carolina Slave Code, which limited to 15 the number of daily labor hours a slaveholder was allowed to take his captive slave, was to take from his captive. So in South Carolina, you can only work 15 hours a day. Slave codes in most of the southern states permitted the master to work his slave as long as he wanted him to work. The historian John Hope Franklin found that on the Louisiana sugarcane plantation, it was not uncommon for the slave drivers to work the slaves up to 20 hours each day during the harvest season. The slave codes permitted the master to breed his chattel as well, to arbitrarily assign a slave woman a sex mate to force her to bear slave children. They allowed the master and non slaveholding whites acting on his directive to rape his slave women and sell the mulatto offspring, if any, for profit. Laws governing the slave master relationship permitted the slaveholder to sell his slaves to pay his debts, to sell his bondswomen into prostitution, and even to dispose of his ill slaves by selling them to medical science for research experimentation. On October 12, 1838, the following advertisement by Dr. T. Stillman on behalf of the medical infirmary appeared in the Charleston Mercury, a South Carolina newspaper of the time. To planters and others, wanted 50 Negroes. Any person having sick Negroes considered incurable with their respective physical and wishing to dispose, considered incurable by their respective physicians and wishing to dispose of them, Dr. S. will pay cash for Negroes affected with scrofula or King's the evil, confirmed hypochondriacism, apoplexy, diseases of the liver, kidney, spleen, stomach, intestines, bladder and its appendages, diarrhea, dysentery, etc. The highest cash price will be paid on application as above. So when we talk about scientific racism and medical apartheid and what they did to our women and how they think that we don't necessarily have the same pain tolerance as other races of people, they actually sold us into medical science research and profited off of that research when we were sick or when they deemed us to be sick. Because do you think that everybody that they sent to go to this medical institute that got this high cash price paid upon application was actually as sick as they thought they were? Probably not. As a practical matter, if a slave tried to resist any of the many uses to which his owner may have put him, statutes prohibiting the slave's murder afforded him no protection. Generally, a slave who simply disobeyed his master's command could have been lawfully killed by the master. The Florida ex-slave Taylor Gilbert understood the consequences of the slave codes for the slave caught off his plantation without a pass. He recalled that often the slaveholders' sons would go nigger hunting, and nothing, not even murder, was too horrible for them to do to the slaves caught without passes. Gilbert said that they justified the murder of a bondsman by claiming that the slave disobeyed their command by simply uttering, "The nigger tried to run away when we told it to stop." In virtually all cases of masters who murdered their slaves, the masters were not prosecuted criminally. The traveler Charles William Jansen observed that when the bloody deed was committed, it was in fact seldom looked into. On the rare occasion where a criminal proceeding was commenced against a slaveholder accused of killing his slave, the homicide of that slave typically ended in an acquittal because the master, in his own defense, would testify that the slave had legally provoked him. Any resistance offered by a slave sufficed as legal provocation, making the killing of that slave lawful. You hear that? Stop resisting, stop resisting. Does that sound like something we hear today when we interact with certain law enforcement? Consequently, even as a court investigated a master's murder of his slave, the slaveholder could assume its sympathy and recap the benefit of its presumption that no rational slave owner would willfully and maliciously kill his valuable human property. Because Ben Simpson saw his master kill his slave mother and go unpunished, cognizant of the fact that slaveholders were hardly ever held accountable for murdering their slaves, he concluded, you know, then there's no law against killing nigger slaves. The slaveholding class used its laws to violently suppress slave revolts. During the last 3 decades of the antebellum era, 11 states passed laws imposing the death penalty on slaves who participated in insurrections. For example, a Georgia law of 1843 and a Virginia law of 1848 made insurrection or an attempt to incite it, whether directly or indirectly, punishable by death. In 13 states, it became a capital crime for free men to incite a slave to insurrection. So even if you were free, if you talked about freedom and incited other slaves to want freedom, you were charged with a capital crime. So your life could be on the line just for talking to free people about freedom. Severe penalties were levied against anyone who helped the slave to run away or who gave him asylum after he escaped. Okay, guys, I'm sorry. My mic just went out on me. I don't know what happened. But yes, we are told to comply and stop resisting. We are told to comply and stop resisting. The slaveholding class used its laws to violently suppress slave revolts during the last 3 decades of the antebellum era. 11 states passed laws imposing the death penalty on slaves who participated in insurrection. For example, the Georgia law of 1843 and a Virginia law of 1848 made insurrection or an attempt to incite it, whether directly or indirectly, punishable by death. In 13 states, it became a capital crime for men to incite insurrection. Severe penalties were levied against anyone who helped a slave to run away or who gave asylum after he escaped. But what about the runaway slave? The Commonwealth of Virginia passed the following legislation recognizing that the repression of runaway slaves may be carried to the point of murder. It would be lawful for any person or persons whatsoever to kill and destroy such runaway slaves by such ways and means as he or she or they should think fit, without accusation or impeachment for any crime of the same. Running was a crime. Enslaved Black people who committed the same crimes as white people suffered harsher penalties. For example, the laws of Maryland sentenced any slave convicted of petty larceny, murder, or willfully burning dwelling houses to have the right hand cut off, to be hanged in the usual manner, the head severed from the body divided into 4 quarters, and the head and quarters set up in the most public places of the county, where such act was committed. Since the law sanctioned the most savage acts of violence imaginable, some slaveholders did not hesitate to commit them. Traveling through the Old South, Harriet Martineau wrote, "Burning alive, cutting the heart out, and sticking it on the point of a knife, the result of the deepest hatred of which the human heart is capable, are heard of here." Whether there were two or 20 of those legally sanctioned public acts of violence each year, surely they instilled deep-seated fear in the slaves and testified to the existence of a grave inhumanity and pathology which alone can explain them. Southern legislators were not only bodies that enacted representative slave laws. On September 18th of 1850, Congress amended the Fugitive Slave Act to make both state and federal governments responsible for capturing runaway slaves and returning them to their owners. Federal law subjected those aiding or harboring runaways or interfering with the capture to fines or imprisonment. As historian Mary Frances Berry observed, the federal government worked vigorously to enforce the new act and to suppress attempted violations. So as you can see, they continue to try to force us into this comply. All right, we got 6 pages left. The omnipresent slave patrols. The last major form of physical repression was the omnipresent slave patrol system. Since they were alarmed by the Nat Turner insurrection of 1831, slaveholders in the South reinforced fear in Black people by increasing the number of slave patrols. We know that about 3/4 of Southern white families did not own slaves, but it was non-slaveholding whites who were given responsibility for enforcing laws restricting the movement of slaves. Alabama and Georgia laws, for example, compelled non-slaveholders under the age of 45 to perform patrol duty. So slave patrol duty was compulsory in white society. Did you hear that? If they were under the age of 45 and they were white and they were in these communities, it was compulsory for them to be on the slave patrol. Those informal civilian armies constituted what the historian Nathan Irvin Huggins calls the arm of community power against slaves. Unless they first obtained written permission from their owners, the slaves were prohibited by slave codes throughout the antebellum South from leaving their plantations or moving about unattended by night. Basically, run by poor white men, the patrols played the major role in limiting the slaves' movement. The historian Leslie Howard Owens noted, sometimes financed by a small tax on slaves above the age of 12 and sometimes voluntary, it was an obvious way for whites to guard against slave resistance while making sure the slaves remained careful of their moves. A system of patrol existed in every slaveholding state. Courts were empowered to appoint one or more patrols for terms not exceeding 3 months to survey all slave quarters and arrest any slave caught off his master's plantation without a pass. Generally, members of a patrol worked in rotation of 2 or 3 periods to spread the responsibility for policing, and some counties in the South imposed small fines upon individuals who neglected to perform their patrol duties. By 1845, Georgia law required every person appointed to slave patrol duty who evaded it to pay a $5 fine. So they were making money off of this. Justices of the peace in each district of the state of Georgia were authorized to determine eligibility for and appointment to patrol duty. The laws of the state required every slave patrol member to carry a pistol while on duty. They also gave the patroller the authority to capture fugitive slaves, search slaves for weapons, and whip them, typically by administering 20 lashes. Even in those regions in the South where patrol methods were inefficient, the patrol system nonetheless left the slave community the perception of pervasive repression. To neutralize the enormous military advantage concentrated in the hands of the slaveholding class, the slaves required power in numbers. However, in the last 3 decades of the antebellum period, blacks outnumbered whites in only 2 slaveholding states. Although some trusted slaves had arms, most did not. As the political economist and historian Manning Marable wrote, some Afro-Americans would be permitted to bear arms within the coercive apparatuses of the state, so long as they were fighting to protect the capitalist political economy and civil society of white racism. Within the ideological apparatuses and civil society, a strict policy of black disarmament was upheld. So they want us without guns. They want us unable to protect ourselves. Blacks outnumbered whites in South Carolina. The law in that state forbade slaves possessing legal permits to be armed to carry weapons in public between Saturday night and Monday morning. No more than 1 slave on any single plantation was permitted to carry a gun. By comparison, the white population, noted Eugene Genovese, sharpshooting and extraordinary feats with arms became elementary marks of manhood. The white population constituted one great militia, fully and even extravagantly armed, tough and resourceful, and capable of all the savagery that racism can instill. If the slave were fortunate enough to endure the torment he suffered on the plantation and survive under the antebellum South's repressive slave codes, the slave patrols would remain for him a formidable barrier to freedom, rendering virtually all avenues of escape unsafe. Most slaves feared the slave patrols. Indeed, Julie Brown, an ex-slave from Georgia, told us that the slave patrol was afraid to go any place, that the slave was afraid to go any place because of the patrols. Henry Bibb wrote that running away the night being very dark among slaveholders and slave hunters, to me, it was like a person entering the wilderness among wolves and vipers blindfolded. The Georgia ex-slave Rachel Adams recalled, slaves never went nowhere without them patrollers beating them up if they didn't have no pass. Sam T. Stewart, a former slave from North Carolina, said that when patrollers caught slaves off the plantation, when patrollers caught slaves off the plantation where no whipping posts were available, they tied them across fences to whip them. Celestia Avery remembered being told by a slave woman about the occasion of her uncle William was caught off the Hurd plantation without a pass and had whipped almost to death by the patty rollers. Some slaves would have told their owners about the whippings. Some slaves would not have told their owners about the whippings for fear of being tortured again. The Oklahoma ex-slave Anthony Dawson and other former slaves would sing song, revealing all too well their awareness of the armed slave patrols. Dawson wondered whether or not Southern whites made up the following song to keep the slaves in line. Run, nigger, the patty roll gon' get you. Run, nigger, run, the patty roll come. Watch, nigger, watch, the patty roll trick you. Watch, nigger, watch, he got a big gun. Slaves were especially antagonistic toward slave patrols and slave hunters because many overstepped their bounds. Some slave patrols disrupted slave social gatherings and religious meetings. Others raped slave women. Slave hunters subjected captured runaways to cruel and unusual treatment. The ex-slave Jacob Stroyer never forgot a South Carolina slave hunter named Mr. Black, who was the most barbarous one he knew. Stroyer wrote, a runaway was with another, who was thought well of by his master, the second of whom killed several dogs and gave Monsignors Black and Motley a hard fight. After the Negro had been captured, they killed him, cut him up, and gave his remains to the dogs. During the Civil War, local governments in the South tightened restrictions on the movement of all Black people. On February 7, 1862, for instance, in the city of Augusta, Georgia, passed the following ordinance limiting the movement of slaves and free persons of color. And this is why it's always about race first, because when you hear this, you will know that no matter how much money you have, whether you're actually quote unquote economically free or not, they still see you as Black first. Any slave or free person of color found riding or driving about the city not having a written pass from his or her owner, hirer, or guardian, because if you were free, you still had to have an employer or guardian, so you weren't autonomous, expressing the date of such pass, the name of the Negro to whom it was given, the place or places to which he is going, how long he or she is to be absent, and in the case of a slave, what such slave is in the services of the person before the recorder's court by which he or she shall be tried, and on conviction shall be punished by whipping not to exceed 39 lashes. As a free person, you could be whipped. As a free person, they could whip you 39 times if you didn't have a piece of paper with you. Fines were imposed on slaveholders who allowed their property to move about unattended. As the historian Mary Frances Berry noted, patrol duty was made a more regular function with increased fines for the failure to perform such duty, and laws requiring white male supervision of slaves on plantations were stringently enforced. In part one, we examined the historiography on the brutality of American slavery. By and large, the scholarship shows a preoccupation with rationalizing and de-emphasizing the slave owner's horrible acts instead of exposing his true disposition. Too many American historians have sought to humanize the master by depicting him in a favorable light. In fact, they've searched for any redeeming qualities in the slaveholder and concealed the true nature and character of the American slavery regime. As a consequence, W.L. Post told us, them was bad times. Them was bad times. I know folks think the books tell the truth, but they sure don't. Us poor niggers had to take it all. Perhaps Martin Jackson said it best. I can tell you, the life of the average slave was not rosy. They were dealt out plenty of cruel suffering. An accurate portrayal of the American slavery regime would reveal the fiendish methods of individual torture used by the slaveholding class and show how that torture, the representative slave codes, and the vicious system of slave patrols created fear in the slave community and prevented widespread slave revolts. During the antebellum period, another violent act of repression, rarely examined today in context, was the rape of black bondswomen. At a time during which feminist literature should have clarified our understanding of rape, studies on master on slave rape are wanting in probing analysis. Why did slaveholders rape their black female captives? In part two, we will scrutinize influential American historians' treatment of the subject of master on slave rape and examine the kind of repression. So, as you can see, he had a lot to say, but basically what he's saying is that they've lied to us. They continue to try to present slaveholders as these humane people, not talking about how they systematically went about changing the laws and codifying our existence and making it illegal to be black, whether you were free or bond. Whether you were free or bond, they could punish you if you didn't have the right paperwork and documentation in your hands. So, this is probably one of the reasons why illegal aliens get so upset and frustrated about being called illegal aliens and asking for their papers, because they know the history that they don't teach us. They know and understand that unfortunately, there's a long history of them asking for the papers of people and asking for whether or not you're in the right place, trying to find out if you have authorization to be where you are, trying to find out if you know if you know anybody in that place, whether or not your master, your owner, your guardian, your hirer, your employer has given you permission to be in such a place. And when I think about school passes, I think about that legacy of our enslavement because they ask for your hall pass. Do you have the right paperwork? Well, if a child is going to the bathroom and they say, my teacher told me I could go, that should be enough. I'm against hall passes at this point after reading this. But we all knew that the police department had a long history of, we knew that the police department had a long history and a legacy of over policing Black people going back to its very inception because it was created to police the existence of Black people. All right, guys, it's almost 10 o'clock. And if you don't have anything to say, then I'm going to get out of here. And we are going to read the next part tomorrow. We'll be reading part 2 tomorrow, talking about Master on Slave Rape at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I think you like this better, a little bit better than the Cambone book. We're going to finish the Cambone book. We'll be back at that on Monday if you're here for the Kobe Cambone book. This will be in its own little playlist. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you tonight?
I'm doing fine, Mitchell. How you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Yeah, it was a great reading, man.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming.
I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt. I mean, was you through? Or, I mean,
Oh, no, I was through.
Yes, ma'am. Man. Okay. But yeah, wow, that was a great reading, Major, as usual, man. I don't know if my sister, I sent her the link and everything, so she may be listening in the chat.
Well, welcome. I'm so glad she's here. If she is here or if she listens to it later.
Yeah. But yeah, that was something else though, man. I was thinking about what you were saying, Matron, how they said how they wanted to keep the enslaved Africans unarmed. You know, and the same thing, the same thing today.
Yeah.
They want to keep they want to keep you unarmed. They will cloak. I think that they will cloak it in something like all of the gun violence that's going on, in the country, and specifically, when they say that, they're talking about in the inner cities, in the urban centers, they're talking about us. They're talking about us. They'll say, they won't say that, they won't say Black people, but they talking about us. And yeah, you know what I'm saying, Major? And I mean, it's been the same old plan from day one, like you said. I mean, it's been the same old plan from day one. I just like. And I can't understand, how we can't get this through our people's heads. You know what I'm saying? Through a lot of our people's heads, that we got to bring an end to all of this bullshit. This division between us, ourselves over minor stuff. You know what I'm saying, Major? Over minor things, and realize that, man, don't you know? Ever since they brought the first African man and woman on shores over here. It's been a war has been declared on you, has been declared on your life. I mean, it's been declared on your psychology, on your mind, as well as your body. But I mean, a war has been declared on us. Like Dr. Wright said, we are in a war, and we're the only ones who don't know that we're in a war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that we have to get to the point where we understand that we are at war and we have a decisive enemy. And that enemy is trying to make us crazy, is trying to break down our physical bodies, is trying to keep us unarmed, is trying to keep us divided. And if we could try to maintain our physical and mental health, arm ourselves, and try to reclaim our time. If we try to reclaim our time by coming out of their employment systems, if we can get guns and recognize that we're working their job only long enough to finance our business, Instead, we get caught up in a debt trap where we go to school. Well, we go to school K through 12, which is in part a waste of time because many of the things that they teach us are only things that they teach us so that we have a babysitter for our kids during the day so that our parents are going to a job. But we go to school K through 12, and then we come out of high school. They don't talk to us about being able to get finance. They talk to us about being able to go into debt to finance our education, but they don't talk to us about grants or opportunities or different programs that we could go into that they've taken out of our community so that we could get a trade, so that we could actually have a skill that's marketable. We don't get to the point where we actually can have some independence and autonomy. We don't have the independence and autonomy to actually do for ourselves. And they continue to take us back. They try to take us back by planting these small seeds of division in our community and within us and other Africans and other Black people and other people of color. And they try to keep us divided because they know that that's when they're strong. Because when we can look around at the other Black people and say, I have more in common with you than I have with these Europeans that continue to oppress us. How about we get together and we form a worker co-op, or we form a food co-op, or we form a gun club? Then we would be better off if we would do those things. I want to say greetings to Shanique Ford. How you doing tonight?
I am doing well. I'm so glad I was able to catch that reading because first off, let me just say your reading was incredible. I appreciate that you are doing this. It was so eye-opening for me because you don't think about it. We know the horrors of slavery, but we don't really focus on just the extent of how just brutal and absolutely deplorable the behavior was. But we do see bits of it every day in current actions. We just kind of think, oh my, where's that coming from? Why would they do that? We're always trying to find the why as to the brutality. But when you read that nothing has changed, it starts to come full circle. And I was thinking about what you just mentioned about us becoming more collective minded when it comes to work, or rather business. Because just recently, my daughter-in-law was telling me, oh, we don't go to Target anymore, because she really liked Target and that was our place. We don't go to Target anymore because, the DEI. And I was like, oh, I had, this was my thought on it. Maybe it was a little naive. Was one of, they're only saying now what I'm sure all of these companies and corporations believe, which is that if they had to not observe any rules when it comes to specifically us, not just all of the other people that fall into the diversity and inclusion group, but specifically us, that they really would not adhere. And when you read that, it showed me that for a lot of them, majority, if you think about it, that's the truth. And we could go back to slavery in a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
But my mindset is that, how I feel about the word, and I don't take it from a perspective of Christianity, but I take it from the perspective of, I know that, as what did Kanye say, slavery was a choice. I know it was, but not in the sense that he said it. But I know that it was because of just our disobedience to the Most High Yah. I know that. But knowing the level of brutality that we endured, and I find solace in the fact that the scriptures also say those who took into slavery will go into slavery. And that's the part that they keep trying to avoid with their legislature and with the things. At that time, it was allowed by the Father, by the Most High. But that time is done. And I think they're believing that it's perpetual, but it really isn't. And I don't know how, outside of us all deciding to come to the Most High, like the scripture says, that if my people who are called by my name, basically, I'll sum it up, would return to him, then he would return us to our land. He would give us that dynamic that we had before we were captives. So for me, and I don't want to take it to too much about your personal religion and faith, rather not religion, but faith, because I know that's not the point of what you were reading. But I just realized that that's the thing that's going to bring about this huge understanding and acceptance and overthrow of one regime for our regime. And we all know by the fact of how we behave that when it comes to being humane, when it comes to being kind, the scripture says we're sottish because we're sottish to wickedness. Yes, we have individuals in our group who can be brutal, but the truth is that is not our common behavior, because if it were, we wouldn't have been in slavery for that long. We would have long overtaken. There'd have been more revolts. So that's all I kind of wanted to say. I'm so thankful that you did that, because I really appreciated hearing it.
Well, I appreciate you for being here. I appreciate you for listening, and I appreciate your very valuable input. You know, there is a spiritual component to this thing that we overlook, but we have to get back to the faith system that makes the most sense for us. And if you have found that, please tap into that, because that is the only way that we come out of this. And arming yourselves and being collectively minded and collectively oriented are going to be the pathways that we have to take in order to make sure that they don't go too far, because they would try to put us back in chains if they thought they could get away with it. They would try
in a heartbeat. we can see it through the day-to-day actions, and as it ramps up the different things that go on within society. But what I have faith in the idea that even with everything that they're trying, they can go with the whatever legislatures and law. The only reason they were allowed it was because the Most High allowed it. I believe there is a creator, and I know that He has said that. What did they say a few years ago? Time's up. The time is up. So that's where the desperation is coming from.
Absolutely. A trapped cat is the most dangerous. A trapped animal is the most dangerous, is its most dangerous at that time. And that's what I think is going on with them.
Yeah.
That's why so many things are imploding. These relationships are deteriorating. They're trying to import more white people so that they can continue to hold up this system. They're trying to do anything that they can to hold on to power because they know their time is up.
Right.
So I appreciate you. I'm glad that it is helping you. I'm glad that this is helping me. I'm glad that we're able to have these conversations and this dialogue. I'm happy to know that we can see the patterns, because our enslavement, even the first time after, I don't think that enslavement happened everything all at once. We know that by the story, but the story is never told that way. It was a slow process. They would go, they had indentured servants. Black indentured servants were easier to identify than white indentured servants. So now all of a sudden slavery is codified into law for Black people only. They have the Fugitive Slave Act. They have all of these things to police Black behavior, which we deal with and live with the legacy of that when every time a cop pulls up behind us. And it's just like, what are you doing in this neighborhood? Do you live here? Are you one of our people? Do you belong in this place where you are? Just because you don't belong in this place, and just because I don't think you belong in this place. Oh, you shouldn't have a car like that. Like Black people shouldn't have nice things. Oh, you can't shop in our stores. You can't come in here. Oh, you shouldn't have enough money to be able to come in here. And that was something that enslaved Black people went through and free Black people went through. And we can see that even though we want to say the color isn't black or white, is green, that is an illusion. The color line has always been black versus white.
You're absolutely right. Sadly, it really is just that clear. Like you said, black and white. And I think that that's where a lot of our people get it confused, because they keep putting this carrot in front of you. If you attain this amount of wealth, if you attain this amount of notoriety, if you attain this amount of fame and acceptance supposedly in society, then now you are, as it was a movie, I think it was Dead Presidents, Bokeem Woodbine said, see, now you good. So that's the idea, that now we have attained to this position that will relieve us from being considered, like you said, chattel, slavery, property of a physical nature, no different than a dog. As a matter of fact, we see every day when something comes up, that they view dogs with way more value. So it's just the idea that we have to recognize it's not about what group we involve ourselves in, outside of the fact that one thing shows you. I don't care where you are. Every country, every place on this planet has a version of a nigger. Every version, every place, and they all recognize that it's specific to those who are melanated. And even in India, where they're all somewhat melanated, they've got a group that is specifically not as valuable, and they don't have to be lighter. They just have to be dark enough to be considered a nigger. So it's something that I think we have to recognize. Okay, we can't keep trying to find a new space to hide. And I think we try to find spaces like economics or society or position to hide in and say, oh, no. Like they say, we have people who come from other places. I know Black. No, you are. And the fact that you recognize it, the point that you recognize it, then we can move to a position of being of one hive mind and move with one thought, which is that regime is over. And this one has to, scripture says it. Esau is the end of the world. Jacob is the beginning of that to come. So it is us, or it is our people that have to have their position, their time again. And that's not any mindset of my own. That's the Most High's ordained. So I know that it's like it's slow in coming, to as far as we see slow in coming, but it's coming. And the funny thing that I find is that when you see things happen in politics and you see things happen around the world, no matter how dire it looks, it all starts to move because all things work to our good. It's all moving to that one thing. I just can't, I'm anxious to get to that point where we see it happening. And I don't care if it's the last minute the Father says repent at any point. The last minute, we all say, oh, wow, it's us. Okay, I'm on board. Because we have to, everyone wants to worship somebody. Why is it so hard to worship the Most High that looks like us? Because we feel like that we've internalized this skin sin, that because we're Black and because we were treated this way and because we're still being treated this way, that is the cause, but it's actually just the effect.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
oh yeah, and I think it's so hard because we are fighting a colonized mindset. So we're fighting white Jesus, trying to accept Black Jesus, in search of Black Jesus, not knowing the truth of the scriptures, not knowing the truth of what's behind those things. Because I have a faith system, a strong faith system, but it doesn't incorporate white Jesus. It doesn't incorporate a white benevolent creator in the sky. It's more active. It's something that I interact with on a daily basis.
And I think a lot of our people do. I think it's something intrinsic within us, because we call things common sense, or we say that we're just compassionate people. But there is something within us that does not allow us, by a collective, a large percentage of us, because we have the outliers who do some unspeakable things. But for generally, we do not conceive of the kind of brutality that has been inflicted upon us. And that's because we do have a God in us, a creator in us, an Elohim in us, a Yah in us. And I know, like you said, we're all having to get there, how we get there. And he is merciful and patient and kind and loving, but he is also a fear-inspiring Elohim. And when if we have not learned anything from the brutality that we were allowed to endure, then we know that brutality is the hand with which he intends to return. And I think that that's what I'm seeking, not in the forefront, because I'm more concerned with I want my people ready. I want us ready. And however we get there in terms of speed is, I don't know. For me, I just want to be on the Most High's time. But I do agree that we can get there because it's in us. It's not something where we have to even spend any energy fighting. I believe this, I believe that. If you recognize that we are the people, then we're over the hump.
We over the hump. We are over the hump. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I appreciate you. And I love your passion and your zeal. It's just wonderful to see Black women and Black people coming together, being able to say, yes, this is the truth. Yes, we went through this pain. Yes, they codified it into law. Yes, they're trying to do it again. Yes, we have to get to the point where we understand that they will do these wicked things, but there's a specific finite timeline. And once we come into the knowledge of ourselves and know who we are, we'll be able to
Yeah.
arm ourselves. We'll be able to come together collectively. We'll be able to organize our economy. We'll stop looking to them for jobs. We have to
Mhm.
use their money system now because that's the system that is prevalent, but they're tanking the dollar. So now let's look to other money systems. Let's look to
Yeah.
skills. Let's look to bartering. Let's look to other things. You know,
Yeah.
we have farmers and we have garbage men and we have a physicist and we have scientists and we have historians and we
Mhm.
have all of those things within our community
Yeah.
to use for ourselves, for our own benefit, for our own good.
Absolutely. I agree. Amen. Amen. I fully agree. And I think that's coming. I think it's coming because it can't be stopped. And we often hear that phrase where, oh, the revolution will not be televised. It doesn't have to be because it's inside of us. We are that kingdom. We
Yeah.
are the people. It is us. And it's slowly moving. It's science. It's quantum entanglement. We are all collectively moving. Those of like mind are moving together and the chaff falls away. But we are going to be victorious. Period.
Absolutely. Sister Ross says, we laughing real hard. And she said, my people will perish for lack of knowledge. Please overstand. Overstand. You know, and
Yes. Yeah.
and we have to get to the point where we, like I said, we're not looking at that book through the eyes of the slave. We have to let the scales fall away so that we can see the light and truth of that book.
Yes, yes. I think that's what the problem. It comes into play where we're constantly seeing. It's like someone tells you, "This is what this means," and then they read that verse. No, we know and can feel. We have to start trusting that that book is talking to us. If your father sends you a letter in the mail, you don't go to someone else to translate what that letter means.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was one of the things, us reading that book without the Eurocentric context is one of the reasons why they used to have a white person in the back of the church
Right?
watching to make
Mhm.
sure that they didn't teach the liberating message that it was, because if that message was taught, they would have killed him and
Mhm.
continued. There would have been even more slave revolts. There were over 250 documented slave revolts. We're going to get into that next month. But there were over 250 documented slave revolts, which they considered an organized group of 10 or more slaves fighting for their freedom. And if they had counted the ones where it was just one person or it was just three people, then it would have been thousands more. So we didn't just passively sit by waiting, and we weren't these passive people. And even in the face of death, there were always those of us that said, give me freedom or give me death.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And you're right. I don't want to cut about say too much, but I remember you said earlier if we could connect to keeping our sanity and all these distractions, everything that is going on are distractions from what is just organic. It's just organic that we collectively get together. That is why every time I tell you, I had an instance where I was in a supermarket with my husband and another group of Black people came, just maybe a couple, and we just started talking about something. Do you know a random white person came about? And I thought, excuse you? Like, why? But it's inside of, I guess they're being, if you knew you treated someone horribly and you're trying to keep them from turning around, then yeah. So we have to stop focusing on, oh, but there's so many good, yeah, okay, that's great. But no one is sitting here thinking about how good the enemy in another town is when you're about to overthrow that town. That's just not the focus.
No, not at all. Not at all. And we have to get to the point where we're not looking at the one good white person that might be your friend that you know. Because that woman that went to sleep at her friend's house that came up dead with all them white people and she's the only
Yeah.
Black person there.
Mhm.
Or that brother that went on the fishing trip with all his white friends and he turned up dead. That's what happens when you hang out with your one
Mhm.
good white friend.
Right.
You
Sadly,
know,
that's true. Yeah. And you can't erase it. It just is what it is. So if you want to have, the group, I just recognize that you got to keep your eye open, and you got to conduct yourself a certain way. But that's just how, yeah, your head on a swivel. But that's how we live in the world in general. I think that this idea of including ourselves, acclimating, becoming homogenized is the huge problem. Like you said, but I'm telling you, I'm seeing a lot of things in just specifically in this country that are creating that divide that will make it impossible for you to not have a side.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And you're going to have to pick. I mean, we're getting to the point in the country and in the world where you're going to have to pick a side, whether you're on the continent, in Brazil, in South America, anywhere in South America, and here in the United States of America. You are going to have to pick a side, and you're going to have to pick the side that you feel is the most powerful, that can overthrow this system that has held everybody back, because white people sick from it too.
Yeah.
White people are sick from the system too, because they think that they have the right to approach a black person. And I love it when I see those videos where it's just like, what are you doing following me to my house? Why are you asking me questions? Who are you?
Right.
And they are sick from the system too, because they feel that they have the right to police black presence. They feel that they have the right to ask us questions and that we're supposed to answer. And when you don't answer, they get really irate.
Yeah. That's why I like you read what you read, because there's the background for those who are, like myself, ignorant to some of the devices that have occurred. Here's the historical evidence of where it's in their DNA almost, where they feel like, because you think, what are you thinking? Where do you get that nerve? Oh, it was already codified within your laws. Oh, it was already part of your history. It is already something you're trying to hide now, but still have in place.
Absolutely.
I'm just grateful you did this. Thank you, Matron.
Well, thank you, Shanique. I appreciate you for coming up. I value you. I value each and every one of you. Sister Ross said, let nature be your guide, seen. Yes, you have to let nature, the nature that is within you, the overriding creator, the spirit of that God essence that is within you, be your guide. The Most High be your guide, because that is the only way that you're going to travail this particular experience of being Black and being on this planet. Tap into that.
Right. I'll say this one last thing. And I find that to be exactly what I read in the word, which is that we have to live by spirit and not by flesh. Our flesh says, oh, we have time to be jealous of our brother, our sister, or covet, or all these things. But we're living in the spirit. We know how to be. And right is right and wrong is wrong. And eye for an eye, all of that's within our DNA.
Yeah.
So that's it. And I'll wrap my mic. Thank you, Matron.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming up. I want to thank Anthony McPhail, the Forecasts, you, of course, you, Shanique Ford, Sister Raw, the Black Business Network, Realm in the Bush, Koku. I know that Oni is listening, and so many others. I thank you for your contributions. I thank you for your financial gifts. I thank you for your support. I'm here doing this work because I think these are the books that we need to read and the information that we need to have so that we can be better armed. And they are taking books off the shelves. There are a lot of books that I want that aren't in print anymore, and I'm looking for them. I have a resource that says that they're working on that for us. But this is the information we should have so that we're able to better understand what we're dealing with. Not just if you don't understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything you do will only confuse you. Not just that type of a book. We need a book that has historical information. We need books that put the slave narratives in context. We need books and information that put these laws in context. I just read an article the other day that said they are still basing property rights on much of what was passed during our enslavement. So slavery has a significant legacy within the legal system because how they adjudicate property rights to this day is still based on how they were adjudicating the ownership of us. Okay, so that means that the way that they say how they divide a house up or how they divide up cars and different things like that, they're using case law that was talking about the adjudication of enslaved people. And we have to recognize that we are the basis of their system. And when we say no more and we come together, then it will stop. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening tonight. I will be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with part 2 of Remembering the Pain. And I will see you then. Peace, guys.